He says, how can it be that all despots are tyrants, but no tyrants are despots? Try writing a Venn diagram for that one. It doesn't work. Talking about how to make government good while your framework requires it to be totalitarian is kind of like putting a band-aid on an axe wound. Hello everybody, and welcome to part 13 of my look at Rousseau's Social Contract. Today we're going to be covering chapters 9 through 11. Now let's get started. Book 3 chapters 9 through 11. So Book 3 chapter 9 is called The Marks of a Good Government, and this is very late in the book to be finally getting to this. So let's actually see what Rousseau is saying here. First off, Rousseau starts by noting that there's no single best government, that it depends on the absolute and relative conditions within and between nations. Now, this is, of course, Rousseau being a little bit reasonable at the start of his chapter before he tries to pull you in later on with more goofiness. I mean, this is kind of obviously true in some sense, that if you have a government and you're surrounded by peaceful nations, then you might need to spend less money and time and effort and worry on defense. But if you're surrounded by hostile nations, you might need to spend a little bit more time, money, and energy defending yourself or preparing to defend yourself. But the real point that ends up making most sense here, if you take it all the way down to its base, is that the best government is one that is approved of explicitly by all of its people, right? This is the direction that the classical liberal tradition was moving toward, government as an agent, right? And your agent, if you have an agent and your agent is no longer serving your purposes, then you can fire him. Now, Locke didn't go that far, and neither did the American founding fathers, but the push was in that direction. That kind of idea of government as an agent and not as a dominator was further improved by Mises and then finally brought to a reasonable conclusion by Rothbard, Hoppe, etc. So Rousseau continues by noting that different people have different conceptions of what good government looks like as well, which is also true. There are various sliding scales that Rousseau talks about. He talks about tranquility versus liberty. He talks about the security of possessions versus the security of persons, which I take to mean like ensuring that everybody has food and water, and taxing the rich if that's required. Kind of welfare statism kind of thing. Severe punishment versus mild punishment. Punishment per se versus prevention of crime, right? Imperial governments versus largely ignored by their neighbors, or, focusing on making sure that money is circulating versus focusing on a welfare state. The problem, of course, is that some of these conceptions are self-defeating or involve forcing one group's will onto another, and that's really kind of the problem, right? In other words, even in a free world, we can let the communists have their communes, but no one should accept or tolerate them forcing a person into one of their communes, right? The laws of economics are going to cause their communes to fail eventually anyway. The purpose of political association, Rousseau says, is the preservation and prosperity of its members. Therefore, Rousseau says, numbers and population are the most obvious markers of good government. He specifically accepts population growth that is done through naturalization or by colonization. Now, as I mentioned in the last part, Rousseau is kind of slapping everything down into this number of people axis scale so that it really doesn't make any actual sense. We'll see a great example of this in the next chapter. This chapter, chapter 9, ends with a very large footnote which is kind of an admonition to government agents. It says, make sure to judge the situations by the whole of the people, or the people in general, and not the conditions of any small but possibly vocal group, including the state itself. People can flourish even in very disturbed situations, and Rousseau makes note of this. And the conclusion is that it may be that laissez-faire and private property can and do flourish under conditions that look very much not like a traditional coercive state. That would be the alternative, and I think better conclusion to draw from the examples that Rousseau points at. Let's move on to chapter 10. All right, book 3, chapter 10 is titled The Abuse of Government and Its Tendency to Degenerate. Rousseau begins by noting that since particular wills, that is, the wills of agents within the government, constantly oppose the general will, eventually the government will move more against the sovereign than in its interest. This breaking of what Rousseau calls the social treaty, that's a quote, is unavoidable. It's worth noting that he's done social contract, he's done social contract, there's another word like contract that I'm forgetting. Anyway, and now he's doing social treaty. He's really, it doesn't make any sense for him to throw around all these words, these differing terms that mean the same thing, except if he's trying to be obfuscating. And I think it's worth noting that. But looking at this particular statement itself, the problem here comes from Rousseau's insistence that people try to keep a state going as long as possible. It's kind of a temporal version of the concept of dominion, right? Governments, Netflix doesn't come and try to repossess your TV if you quit a subscription for Netflix. But if you say you're going to secede from a state and take your land with you, well, they'll get very, very angry at you, generally speaking. In Rousseau's framework, the collapse of a bad state is seen as some kind of a failing on the part of it or its people, much as the loss of territory is seen as a failing for a traditional coercive state, or the state's people, right? For failing to defend that territory, even if the persons who occupy and own, hypothetically, that territory are saying this isn't working for us anymore, we're out. They need to defend that territory. If instead a state acted like a service or an agent, which is kind of where the classical liberal tradition was moving, right? It would expect people and land to enter and exit as customers, decide what works and what doesn't work. Now, of course, when you have these massive states that have been working on the concept of dominion for a long time, suddenly popping secession onto the table would probably make some chaos, but that chaos is kind of the unstretching of a spring that's been wound up for so long, and it's kind of the fault of having this dominion system in the first place. Rousseau continues. He says there are two main ways that the government degenerates. Number one is contraction. It's the passing of power from the many to the few. And then the other one is dissolution, which can happen in one of two ways, Rousseau notes. Either the prince stops administering with respect to the laws, and the prince becomes his own little state. And again, I'm using the term prince in the form of all of the government agents as a body, right? So basically it's the government ignores the will of the people, and its corporate will becomes a new general will for itself, but also that general will is forced upon the rest of the people. That is to say, that the people are now slaves to this new smaller state, which ignores their contributions to sovereign whatever. Rousseau notes that these people are forced, but not bound to obey, which I think is actually a very good point to make, but one that Rousseau holds off to, and not just Rousseau, but reasonable people, generally speaking, often hold off until it's way too far gone for it to be meaningful at that point. The other method of dissolution that Rousseau talks about is when individual magistrates usurp small territorial powers for themselves that were meant to be exercised as a group. It's basically that the government, the state, the agents split off into a bunch of little states where, the mayor of city X now is the ruler of city X, and the mayor of city Y is now the ruler of city Y, whereas the way that it was supposed to have worked was that all the different mayors got together and made choices about everything together, right? So this is another way that the state dissolves or dissolution, undergoes dissolution in Rousseau's thinking. So the problem with this is that the measure of a good state from the last chapter, that is to say the increase in the number of people in that state, is also connected by Rousseau with this contraction a few chapters back. Remember that he talked about how, monarchy suits large states, and aristocracy medium-sized states, and democracy small states, but now monarchy suits large states but also heralds their destruction, right? Because we've got this one axis, if a state is successful, it gets larger numbers. But then also monarchy becomes more suited to it. Therefore, there's a force that inevitably, so to speak, pushes toward a smaller and smaller prince. That is to say, a prince consisting of fewer and fewer people, which then leads to the collapse of the state. It seems like, what we should be aiming at is something that is actually, approved of and can grow and shrink as needed and doesn't necessarily have these inevitable tendencies to self-collapse. That would be kind of a improvement, I would say. This is just another issue with Rousseau's kind of single-axis view of state quality. Moreover, a group of people need not necessarily expand their numbers to be prosperous. This is something that like modern governments often worry about because they're like, GDP is going down, but GDP per capita is going up. That can be a thing. And, a large increase in wealth with a roughly constant population can be prosperous if it happens, right? Of course, when all of commerce and stuff is controlled by the government, generally speaking, a reduction in GDP, gross GDP, means a decrease in tax revenues. And now that's a problem for the modern coercive state. Not so much the people being wealthy, but not necessarily flourishing in numbers as much. Rousseau moves on next to a kind of a definitional argument where he's talking about a tyrant versus a despot. And this is one of those things where he gets very semantical for no really compelling reason. And he doesn't even do a good job of it. Here we'll go. He says, quote, a tyrant, quote, arrogates to himself the royal authority without it having a right to it, end quote. He says that this is equivalent to a usurper. A tyrant is a usurper. These two words are equivalent to Rousseau. They operate contrary to the law. By contrast, Rousseau says, a despot, quote, usurps the sovereign power, end quote, or, quote, sets himself above the laws themselves, end quote. And then he finishes by saying, quote, the tyrant cannot be a despot, but the despot is always a tyrant. This sounds to me a lot like Rousseau was trying to mimic Locke's distinction between usurpation and tyranny. I'll put a link in the show notes about that. But he ends up sounding absurd. He says, how can it be that all despots are tyrants, but no tyrants are despots? Try writing a Venn diagram for that one. It doesn't work. Locke's distinction made a little bit more sense, but again, what ends up happening is that people just start calling everything usurpers anyway. So because what ended up happening is that Locke makes a very careful distinction about usurpers, but the people that took Locke's stuff forward, the American founding fathers, ended up using usurper pretty much in the same vein as tyrant in a lot of ways too, because often the line between them is very blurry. How can one tell if one is operating outside the law or if one has arrogated powers that they're not allowed to have? These two things can have very similar appearances, outward appearances. It's a difference without that much. It's a distinction without that much of an important difference, especially since people are typically going to use these things a lot more. What's the word? They're going to use these terms a lot more sloppily in discourse anyway. So whatever. This chapter also ends with another large footnote, and he spends a bunch of time arguing about the progression and deterioration of the states of Venice and Rome. Now, he notes that Venice has deteriorated to an aristocracy but has held the line, and he's talking about a span of like 1,200 years at this point for Venice. And then he's talking about the initial state of Rome and how it died as a hereditary aristocracy, and then a new democracy arose, which eventually deteriorated into a monarchy, that is to say Caesar, etc. There are, I think, a couple of good points to talk about with this, but again, the historical questions are a little bit beyond the scope of this critique. But first, number one, Venice isn't providing enough evidence to support Rousseau's case thoroughly. All he posits is that it's moved from democracy to aristocracy over these 1,200 years, and that's it. That doesn't really prove your case. It's just like one example that kind of sort of follows a little bit, but shows that this process can be so slow as to be practically undetectable. Then Rousseau's talking about Rome, and his case for Rome is simpler and appears to roughly support his case, the historical data that he provides, given the caveats that he makes, but one data point does not a trend make. Moreover, without a better theoretical understanding of how this transfer happens, it remains entirely possible that other states might move in opposite directions, or back and forth, or whatever. He hasn't logically proven that this can't happen. There are also, of course, a lot of confounding factors that Rousseau is missing by nature of his framework, where he's not thinking about invasions and conquests, and those mess with these predictions as well because they change the form of the state through a violent upheaval rather than kind of gradual population pressures. Anyway, that is all we've got to say pretty much, I think, about chapter 10. Let's move on to chapter 11. All right, book 3, chapter 11 is called The Death of the Body Politic. Rousseau begins this chapter by noting that men cannot make the state live forever. Quote, but it is for them to prolong as much as possible the life of the state by giving it the best possible constitution, end quote. Make good constitutions and laws is not really a great piece of advice, especially when your framework depends on the state being very totalitarian. It sounds good, but it's vague beyond any actual reasonable usefulness. Moreover, this kind of dovetails really well with one of my favorite Thomas Jefferson quotes. To quote Thomas Jefferson from the Declaration of Independence, mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. Now, this is one of my favorite Jefferson quotes because the point behind it is that people, in general, that the state depends on massive public approval for its power. But if the state starts to mess around, the vast majority of people are also very likely to say, well, we'll tolerate this. Well, we'll tolerate this. And you get this kind of like pile-on of like, stick upon stick upon stick upon stick upon stick until you have a big old pile of sticks holding you down. And everybody, and 70% of the people in the government think, oh, these sticks are fine. We'll just put one more stick down and that'll fix the problem. Basically, Rousseau here is telling us to suffer as much as we can under a failing or tyrannical state because he believes the existence and maintenance of a state, even a bad one, is more important than individuals. I would rather that men withdraw their support from a bad state than let it, and therefore let it wither all the faster. That seems to be the better alternative to me. Rousseau goes on to note that it's another stupid thing that Rousseau does here. He says that the legislative power is the heart and the executive power is the brain. He says that man and state may live with a paralyzed brain, but not in an active heart. This is actually very funny. If you remember back to, I think it was book 1, when Rousseau said that the state cannot be separated into parts like this. He goes on and on and on for a good chunk of a chapter saying, people that separate the state into different parts are making a major mistake and blah, 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 blah. And he just does it right here in a big way, where he's like making this extended metaphor that doesn't really help anything. I'll put a link, I'll find it and I'll put a link in the short show notes and description. Rousseau goes on to say this, quote, yesterday's law is not binding today, but silence is taken for tacit consent, and the sovereign is held to confirm incessantly the laws it does not abrogate as it might, end quote. Tacit consent, but under what kind of duress are we talking? States frequently make it more difficult by way of various rules to abrogate previous decisions than to make new ones. This kind of results in a tendency to lay new law after new law after new law without ever actually abolishing anything in any clear way. And what you end up with is a body of laws that's so self-contradictory and so massive that only a few people can claim to understand it, right? And that's another thing that states love to do. They love to create a priestly class that can understand the laws, and they're the ones whose interpretations are valid, and everybody else's interpretations based on just the words themselves, or tradition or natural law ideas, is completely invalid, or only as valid as the priests say they are, I guess is the better way to put it. Practically, what this means is that the law means whatever this priestly class wants it to mean, and they can make that work by a clever selection of precedents in any given case. Rousseau goes on to finish out this chapter by saying this, that old laws garner respect because they have been maintained and enforced for so long, which is equivalent to the sovereign recognizing them as useful or positive. Good old laws, quote, continually gain new strength in any well-constituted state. The precedent of antiquity makes them daily more venerable, while wherever the laws grow weak as they become old, this proves that there is no longer a legislative power, end quote. Assuming that old laws are good laws is a strange stretch for the anti-traditionalist Rousseau. It ignores many possibilities that are actually valid. For instance, that the state enacts a bad law and then enforces it vigorously in order to keep the people weak, poor, and subservient, which is what Rousseau's framework has demanded earlier. Since there's no way to measure the general will, there's no practical way to distinguish between old good and old bad law, right? A state can, for very bad reasons, vigorously enforce some really bad old law, and Rousseau is like, oh, well, that means that the law is good because the sovereign says so over such a long period of time. It's like, well, no, that's not true. These people who make up the prince are, enforcing this law against the people's wishes. But since there's no way to prove that in like a verbal way, all we have to do is, Rousseau's like, well, it must be good then, because that must be what the people want. It's mind-bogglingly stupid. I mean, we're just getting to the point where Rousseau is contradicting himself all over the place and saying that things need to be good while also being totalitarian. It's really strange, and at this point, I'm pretty well convinced that Rousseau's social contract was just kind of an attempt by Rousseau to divert the direction of, and a fairly successful, attempt by Rousseau to divert the trend of the classical liberal philosophy back into totalitarianism. And we see this today where everyone's like, well, you're part of a social contract. It's like, well, I didn't sign shit. Anyway. This covers chapters 9 through 11 of Book 3 of the Social Contract. Next up, we're going to have another 3 chapters. You may remember that in Book 2, I believe, Rousseau had 3 chapters on the people, I believe. Now he's going to have 3 chapters on how the sovereign authority maintains itself. And so, well, we'll see that next time. Anyway, that will do it for today. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Going through these old texts and actually looking at them directly, is, I think, something helpful in helping to debunk the ideas that, oh yeah, this is the way that everybody should go because this is just how it went. And it helps to get a wider perspective of this stuff. But anyway, if you like the channel, if you like what I'm doing, you know what to do. There'll be links in the description as usual. And have a good rest of your week, and I will see you next time.